October 1987. The quarter-mile clock reads 13.4 seconds. The speedometer needle sweeps past 104 miles per hour. The driver steps out, removes his helmet, and stares at the timing slip in disbelief. This wasn't a Corvette. It wasn't a Mustang. It wasn't even a Camaro. This was a Buick. A grandpa's luxury sedan had just obliterated America's muscle car royalty. The car was matte black, sinister as a hearse, with nothing but subtle badges to hint at the mechanical violence lurking beneath its hood. No racing stripes. No chrome exhaust tips. No bold graphics screaming about horsepower. Just an understated Buick Regal that had somehow transformed into the fastest production car in America. The Buick GNX sprinted to 60 miles per hour in 4.7 seconds and ran the quarter mile in 13.4 seconds with a 104 miles per hour trap speed. The Buick GNX was quicker than every single one of its muscle car contemporaries, including the Ford Mustang GT, the Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z, and the Chevrolet Corvette. Let that sink in. A Buick, the brand your grandmother drove to church on Sundays, just embarrassed the Corvette, GM's flagship sports car. It left the legendary Ford Mustang 5.0 eating its dust. It had made the Camaro IROC-Z look like it was towing a boat trailer. The numbers were brutal and undeniable. While the vaunted Mustang GT struggled to break into the 14-second range, managing quarter-mile times of 14.7 seconds at 94 miles per hour, and the Camaro IROC-Z could only muster quarter-mile times of 14.43 seconds. This unassuming Buick was running consistent 13.4-second passes. The Corvette, with its refined L98 V8 and sports car pedigree, couldn't even keep pace with what looked like a funeral director's daily driver. Motor Trend's test team couldn't believe their instruments. The GNX, with 55 more horses and an additional 25 pounds of mass, rockets to 60 in 4.7 seconds and squirts through the quarter mile in 13.5 seconds at 102 miles per hour. In 0 to 60 performance, the only car available in the United States that matches the Buick is the Callaway twin-turbo Corvette. Think about that for a moment. The only American car that could match the Buick's acceleration was a heavily modified Corvette that cost nearly twice as much and required extensive aftermarket engineering. Meanwhile, this Buick rolled off the production line ready to humiliate supercars. But here's where the story gets even more shocking. Under that sinister black hood wasn't a thundering V8. There was no 454 big block, no 427 side oiler, no screaming 302 small block. Instead, there sat a 3.8-liter V6. A six-cylinder engine that displaced less than most economy car motors was somehow producing more real-world performance than America's most legendary V8 seconds. The automotive press was stunned into silence. For decades, the formula had been simple. If you wanted serious performance, you needed 8 cylinders. V8 seconds were the undisputed kings of American muscle. From the legendary 427 Cobra to the fire-breathing 446 pack, 8 cylinders and cubic inches were the only currency that mattered at the drag strip. Yet here was a Buick, powered by what most enthusiasts would consider a compromise engine, rewriting the fundamental laws of American performance. The GNX wasn't just fast. It was revolutionary. It proved that decades of conventional wisdom about engine displacement and cylinder count were nothing more than mythology. Officially, Buick claims a 0 to 60 miles per hour time of 5.4 seconds for the GNX versus their grand national number of 6.9. Through the quarter mile, the GNX clocks 13.4 seconds at 104 miles per hour against 15.7 at 97.5. But even those conservative factory numbers told only part of the story. Independent testing revealed the truth was even more devastating for the V8 establishment. The GNX had accomplished something that seemed impossible in 1987. It had taken the fundamental concept of American muscle and turned it inside out. While Ford, Chevrolet, and Pontiac continued their desperate quest for more cubic inches and higher compression ratios, Buick had quietly developed a forced induction monster that made their efforts look antiquated. This wasn't just about one car being faster than another. This was about the complete overthrow of American performance hierarchy. The GNX had proven that a well-engineered V6 with proper turbocharging could utterly destroy the most revered V8s in American automotive history. It was a mechanical revolution disguised as a luxury sedan. But how did it happen? How did Buick, a division known more for velour seats and wire wheels than quarter-mile times, manage to build the most potent street machine in America? How did a 3.8-liter V6 become the engine that toppled the V8 establishment? The answer lies in a perfect storm of corporate politics, engineering brilliance, and sheer audacity. While the rest of Detroit clung to the past, Buick embraced the future. While their competitors added displacement and complications, Buick mastered the art of forced induction. While others built engines, Buick built a legend. The GNX represented more than just impressive quarter-mile times. It was proof that American ingenuity could still shock the world. It showed that innovation mattered more than tradition. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the future of performance wouldn't be measured in cubic inches, but in boost pressure. This is the story of how a small team of Buick engineers created the most unlikely muscle car in American history. It's the tale of how a 3.8-liter V6 became the engine that killed the golden age of the American V8. It's the shocking truth behind the car that proved everything we thought we knew about performance was wrong. The GNX didn't just beat the competition. It obliterated the very concept of what American muscle was supposed to be, and in doing so, it changed everything. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than? The year was 1973, and American muscle was dying a slow, bureaucratic death. What had once been an arms race of horsepower and cubic inches suddenly became a survival game played by lawyers, emissions engineers, and insurance actuaries. The muscle car era that had roared to life in the 1960s was now gasping for air through catalytic converters and strangled by safety regulations. By the early 1980s, the damage was complete. America's legendary performance machines had been reduced to shadows of their former glory. The Corvette, once the undisputed king of American sports cars, was limping along with anemic power figures that would have embarrassed a family sedan from the golden age. The mighty 454 big blocks were extinct. The 446 packs were history. Even the legendary 427s existed only in the fevered dreams of hot rodders and the dusty corners of salvage yards. With the crude technology of those days, before digital engine controls, most emissions-cutting solutions came at the expense of power. A low point of this process came in 1978, when Ford sold 460 cubic inch, 7.5-liter V8 seconds, making just 202 horsepower. Think about that. 7.5 liters of displacement producing the same power as a modern 4-cylinder economy car. It was automotive castration on an industrial scale. The malaise era had arrived with a vengeance, and Detroit was stumbling through the darkness like a heavyweight boxer who'd taken one too many hits to the head. Every solution seemed to create 3 new problems. Catalytic converters killed power. Lean burn engines ran rough. Air pumps robbed horsepower. The very act of making cars cleaner and safer was systematically destroying everything that made them exciting. But by the mid-1980s, something had changed. The survivors were clawing their way back from the abyss. New technology was beginning to mature. Electronic fuel injection was replacing crude carburetors. Computer engine management was optimizing performance within the constraints of emissions regulations. As the industry adapted to new regulations, vehicle performance began to increase again as technologies matured. Onboard computers, electronic fuel injection, 3-way catalytic converter, and modern oxygen sensors enabled greater raw performance and less hobbling emission controls. The resurrection wasn't uniform, but it was real. By 1987, America's muscle car legends were experiencing their first real renaissance in over a decade. The Ford Mustang GT had clawed its way back to respectability with its 5-liter V8 producing 225 horsepower. The Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z offered buyers a choice between a 215 horsepower, 305 cubic inch V8 or a more potent 225 horsepower, 350 cubic inch power plant borrowed directly from the Corvette. Even Pontiac's Firebird Trans Am was back in the fight with similar specifications. These weren't the tire-melting monsters of 1969, but they were legitimate performance machines again. The Mustang GT could sprint from 0 to 60 in the low 6-second range and run the quarter mile in the mid-14s. Back in 1987, the Camaro IROC-Z rolled out an optional 5.7-liter, 225-horse L98 V8 to combat the top-dog Mustang GT, which featured the same horsepower figure from its 5-liter V8. The competition was heating up again, and enthusiasts were finally starting to believe that performance wasn't dead after all. The Chevrolet Corvette, GM's flagship sports car, was also climbing out of its dark era. The C4 generation, introduced in 1984, represented a massive improvement over the emission-strangled C3 that had limped through the late 1970s and early 1980s. By 1987, the Corvette's L98 350 cubic inch V8 was producing 240 horsepower, making it the most powerful engine in GM's lineup. It wasn't the 427 big block glory of the past, but it was progress. Yet, for all their improvements, these resurrected legends still carried the DNA of traditional American performance thinking. More displacement equaled more power. V8 configuration was mandatory for serious performance. Cubic inches were the benchmark of respect at the strip. The fundamental formula hadn't changed since the 1950s. Take a big engine, stuff it into the lightest chassis possible, and let physics handle the rest. The Mustang GT exemplified this philosophy perfectly. Ford's 5.0-liter V8, while improved with electronic fuel injection and better breathing, was still fundamentally the same small block architecture that had powered Mustangs in the 1960s. The smaller engine is a 215 horsepower gem that's happy right up to its 5,500 revolutions per minute redline. This was referring to the Camaro's 305, but the sentiment applied across the board. These engines were honest, straightforward V8 seconds that made power the old-fashioned way through displacement and revolutions. The Camaro IROC-Z took a slightly different approach, offering buyers two distinct V8 options. There was also a 305 cubic inch tuned port injection LB9 available with 215 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. This power plant was only available with a 4-speed automatic transmission. The more powerful option was the 350 cubic inch L98, the same engine used in the Corvette, which bumped power up to 225 horsepower. These improvements represented real progress, but they also highlighted the limitations of traditional V8 technology. Despite years of development and the application of modern fuel injection systems, the power density remained stubbornly low. The Corvette's 5.7-liter V8 produced just 42 horsepower per liter. The Mustang's 5-liter managed only 45 horsepower per liter. These were respectable figures for the era, but they were still constrained by the fundamental physics of naturally aspirated engines. More troubling was the fact that these gains had come at considerable cost and complexity. The tuned port injection system used by GM was an engineering marvel, but it was also expensive to produce and maintain. The intricate plastic intake manifolds and maze of vacuum lines required for emissions compliance added weight, cost, and potential failure points. Detroit was solving the performance problem, but it was doing so with brute force engineering rather than elegant innovation. The insurance companies weren't making things any easier. Young drivers who wanted to experience American performance were being priced out of the market by astronomical insurance premiums. The IROC-Z, Trans Am, and Mustang GT all carried the dreaded sports car designation that sent insurance rates into the stratosphere. Even if you could afford the car, the cost to insure was sky high. Meanwhile, import manufacturers were taking a completely different approach to performance. Turbocharging was becoming commonplace in European cars, with manufacturers like Saab and Volvo proving that forced induction could deliver both power and efficiency. The Japanese were experimenting with twin-turbo setups and sophisticated engine management systems that made American fuel injection look primitive by comparison. But Detroit wasn't paying attention to these developments. The American automotive establishment was too busy fighting the last war, trying to recapture the glory days of the 1960s through incremental improvements to existing technology. The belief was unshakable. Real American performance came from big V8 engines with lots of displacement. Anything else was a compromise. This conventional wisdom ran so deep that it was almost religious in nature. V8 engines weren't just power plants, they were cultural artifacts. The sound of a big block at full throttle was the soundtrack of American automotive supremacy. The feel of massive torque hitting at low revolutions per minute was what separated American muscle from foreign pretenders. Displacement was destiny, and cubic inches were the only honest measure of an engine's worth. Into this environment stepped Buick, GM's luxury division, with an idea that seemed almost heretical. What if you could make serious power without cubic inches? What if forced induction could be the great equalizer? What if a well-engineered V6 could actually outperform the legendary V8 seconds that everyone worshipped? It was a radical concept that challenged every assumption about American performance. But by 1987, Buick was about to prove that everything the muscle car establishment believed was wrong. The revolution was coming, and it was wearing a Buick badge. While Ford was desperately trying to resurrect the Mustang and Chevrolet was polishing the chrome on their IROC-Z badges, something revolutionary was happening in the most unlikely corner of General Motors. Buick, the division that had built its reputation on velour seats and wire-spoke wheels, was quietly conducting experiments that would shatter every assumption about American performance. It started with a paradox. In an era when every serious performance car needed a V8, Buick was doubling down on a V6. While their competitors were obsessing over cubic inches and compression ratios, Buick engineers were exploring a technology that most Americans associated with exotic European imports: turbocharging. It was engineering heresy disguised as luxury car development. The seeds of this revolution were planted in 1976, when Buick found itself in the spotlight as the official pace car provider for the Indianapolis 500. When Lloyd Rice was chief engineer for Buick, he oversaw the development of the 1976 Indy pace car and its 3.8 turbo V6. This wasn't just a marketing exercise. It was a real-world laboratory for forced induction technology that would eventually change everything. Lloyd Rice was the kind of engineer who understood that the future wouldn't be found in the past. While most of GM's brass were still thinking in terms of big blocks and displacement, Rios saw turbocharging as the key to unlocking power from smaller, more efficient engines. He was a visionary, operating in a company culture that worshipped tradition, and his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom would prove prophetic. The 1976 pace car program gave Buick engineers their first taste of what turbocharged performance could deliver. The 3.8-liter V6, when properly boosted, could produce power levels that rivaled much larger engines while consuming significantly less fuel. But this was still the experimental phase. The technology wasn't ready for mass production, and the automotive world wasn't ready for a turbocharged Buick. But when this engine found its way into the 1978 Regal Sport Coupe and LeSabre, Rios was on his way to Chevrolet to be director of engineering. The torch was passed, but the vision remained. Buick's commitment to turbo technology would outlive its original champion. The first production turbocharged Buick arrived in 1978 with little fanfare and modest expectations. Rated at 165 horsepower, the turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 first made it to production in 1978. This was respectable power for the era, especially considering it came from an engine that displaced less than 4 liters. But it was just the beginning. What made the Buick turbo experiment so radical wasn't just the technology itself, but the corporate politics behind it. GM's internal structure was fiercely territorial. Chevrolet was the performance division. Pontiac handled excitement. Buick was supposed to focus on comfort and luxury. For Buick to venture into serious performance territory was like watching your accountant enter a boxing match. Yet this unusual corporate arrangement worked to Buick's advantage. While Chevrolet and Pontiac were locked in traditional V8 thinking, Buick had the freedom to explore alternatives. They weren't constrained by muscle car heritage or performance expectations. They could experiment with forced induction without betraying their brand identity because nobody expected Buick to build fast cars in the first place. The early results were promising but not earth-shattering. The lighter weight made the standard V6 engine a more viable prospect than previously, and it allowed the new Turbo 6 to return respectable performance, 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 10 seconds, sprightly for that era. The 1980 models were up to 175 horsepower, but sales slumped, affected by the general stagnation that had settled over the American automotive industry. But the engineers weren't discouraged. They understood that they were working with technology that could scale dramatically. Unlike naturally aspirated engines, which required expensive displacement increases to make more power, turbocharged engines could be improved through better boost control, intercooling, and engine management systems. The potential was enormous. Chevrolet borrowed the Buick V6 Turbo for the G-Body Monte Carlo in 1980 and 1981, selling a respectable 20,000 units. But by 1982, the family of turbos was pared down to just the Regal and the front-wheel drive Riviera, both known as the T-Type since the previous year, presenting two very different approaches to turbocharged performance. This consolidation was actually a strategic advantage. By focusing their turbo development efforts on fewer platforms, Buick could concentrate resources and accelerate improvements. The T-Type designation became their laboratory for advanced forced induction technology, allowing engineers to push boundaries without the pressure of mass-market expectations. The breakthrough came in 1982 with the introduction of the Grand National. This wasn't just another trim level or appearance package. It was Buick's declaration that they were serious about performance. The name itself was borrowed from NASCAR's Grand National Series, signaling that this Buick was built for speed, not Sunday drives to the country club. The much hotter 200 horsepower Grand National would follow 6 years later. This represented a significant leap forward from the original 165 horsepower Turbo V6. More importantly, it demonstrated that Buick's forced induction technology was maturing rapidly. While traditional Vate seconds were making incremental gains through fuel injection and better breathing, the Turbo V6 was making quantum leaps in performance. The decision to paint every Grand National black wasn't arbitrary. Other colors were considered, but the decision to make all GNs black gave them a sinister Darth Vader look. This was psychological warfare. The black paint scheme sent a message that this wasn't your grandmother's Buick. This was something darker, more dangerous, and fundamentally different from anything the luxury division had ever produced. By 1984, the pieces were falling into place. In 1984, Buick finally put the key elements of its two racing programs together to produce an exciting new Grand National Regal for full production. This helped drive all Regal Turbo V6 sales up even further, with a total of 5,401 turbocharged V6 Regals being sold. These weren't enormous numbers, but they represented something more important than sales figures. They proved that there was a market for non-traditional American performance. What was happening behind the scenes was even more significant. Buick engineers were developing expertise in areas that their competitors were ignoring. Intercooler design, boost management, sequential fuel injection, and computer-controlled engine management were becoming core competencies. While Ford and Chevrolet were perfecting variations on themes they'd been playing for decades, Buick was learning to speak an entirely new language of performance. The racing connection wasn't just marketing fluff. Its stock-block turbocharged V6 Indy cars won the pole position and second spot in qualifying for the Indianapolis 500 in 1985, the first time since Mighty Duesenberg in 1931 that an American production-based car had won the Indy pole. This was validation at the highest level of motorsport. The technology that Buick was developing for street cars was competitive with the most exotic racing engines in the world. The corporate support was crucial to this development. After his team traveled the world to benchmark the best auto plants, Reuse convinced GM's top brass to invest some $300 million to modernize the automaker's aging Flint, Michigan operations in the early 1980s to create what became Buick City, modeled after Toyota City in Japan. This wasn't just about building cars more efficiently. It was about creating the infrastructure necessary to support advanced manufacturing techniques and quality control standards that turbocharged engines demanded. By the mid-1980s, Buick had achieved something remarkable. They had created a completely parallel development path to traditional American performance. While their competitors were still arguing about bore and stroke ratios, Buick was mastering the art of extracting massive power from small displacement engines through forced induction. The Grand National was no longer just an experiment or a low-volume specialty car. It was becoming a legitimate threat to the established performance hierarchy. Each year brought significant improvements in power, reliability, and sophistication. The gap between Buick's turbocharged V6 and the naturally aspirated V8 from Ford and Chevrolet was closing rapidly. More ominously for the V8 establishment, Buick's approach offered advantages that went far beyond simple power output. Turbocharged engines delivered massive torque at low revolutions per minute, making them devastatingly effective in real-world driving situations. The fuel economy was superior to comparable V8. The manufacturing costs were lower. The weight distribution was better. But that's not all. The technology was scalable in ways that naturally aspirated engines could never match. A V8 engine making 225 horsepower was close to its practical limits given emissions and durability requirements. A turbocharged V6 making 200 horsepower was just getting started. By 1987, Buick had spent nearly a decade perfecting their turbocharged V6 technology. They had learned hard lessons about boost management, intercooling efficiency, and engine durability. They had developed manufacturing processes that could deliver consistent quality at reasonable costs. They had created a reputation for performance that nobody had expected from a luxury car division. The stage was set for a direct confrontation with America's muscle car legends. Buick's decade of turbo experimentation was about to pay dividends that would shock the automotive world. The V6 that nobody took seriously was ready to prove that everything the performance establishment believed about power and displacement was wrong. The laboratory phase was over. The revolution was in the making. By 1987, the battle lines were drawn. America's muscle car legends had clawed their way back from the decline-era grave, and they were ready to reclaim their throne. The Ford Mustang GT, Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z, Corvette C4, and Pontiac Firebird Trans Am represented the best that traditional American performance had to offer. These were the undisputed kings of the drag strip, the heroes of magazine covers, and the dreams of every teenage gearhead in America. Then there was the Buick Grand National, lurking in the shadows like a mechanical assassin. It didn't look the part. It didn't sound the part. But it was about to prove that everything the performance world believed about power and prestige was built on outdated assumptions. This wasn't just another comparison test. This was a trial by combat that would determine the future of American performance. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Buick's turbocharged V6 could legitimately challenge the V8 establishment, it would shatter decades of muscle car mythology. If it failed, forced induction would remain a curiosity for European exotics and economy cars. The 1987 Ford Mustang GT represented everything that American muscle was supposed to be. Its 5-liter high-output V8, now equipped with sequential electronic fuel injection, produced a respectable 225 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque. The Ford Mustang GT 5.0 V8 has a power-to-weight of 161 bhp per ton and 214.7 pound-feet per ton, which helps it complete a quarter mile in an estimated 14.97 seconds and an estimated trap speed of 91 miles per hour. The Mustang had earned its reputation through decades of street credibility and racing success. It was the affordable performance car, the everyman sports car, the vehicle that proved you didn't need exotic engineering or European pretensions to have serious fun. Magazine tests consistently showed the 1987 GT capable of 0 to 60 times in the mid 6-second range, with quarter-mile runs typically falling between 14.5 and 15 seconds depending on conditions and driver skill. But the Mustang's greatest strength was also its weakness. The 5.0's high output was a refined, naturally aspirated engine that delivered power in a predictable, linear fashion. What you felt was what you got. There were no surprises, no sudden surges of boost-fed torque, no technological tricks. It was honest, straightforward American muscle, but it was also fundamentally limited by the laws of physics that govern naturally aspirated engines. Chevrolet's answer to the Mustang came in the form of the IROC-Z, a car that took its name from the International Race of Champions series and backed up that racing pedigree with serious engineering. The IROC-Z offered buyers two distinct V8 options, each representing a different philosophy about how to build performance. The base engine was the 305 cubic inch LB9, equipped with tuned port injection and rated at 215 horsepower. The LB9 5-liter tuned port injection was now rated at 220 horsepower with a manual transmission, and the 5.7-liter, now dubbed the B2L, gained 5 horsepower over last year. Road and Track tested the IROC-Z equipped with the 5-liter LB9 and manual transmission and garnered a 0-60 time of 6.9 seconds. For buyers who demanded maximum performance, there was the optional 350 cubic inch L98 V8, the same engine used in the Corvette. This power plant produced 225 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque, making it the most powerful engine available in a Camaro. The tuned port injection system was a technological marvel for its time, using long intake runners to optimize airflow at different revolutions per minute ranges. Yet, even with all this sophistication, the IROC-Z struggled to deliver performance that matched its impressive specifications. Equipped with the top-of-the-line 350 L98, the IROC won the top-speed battle, but it just didn't pass the sniff test. The car's substantial weight and complex intake system often resulted in quarter-mile times that disappointed compared to its power figures on paper. If the IROC-Z represented Chevrolet's attempt to build the ultimate muscle car, the Corvette C4 was their flagship sports car, the vehicle that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of American automotive performance. The 1987 Corvette's L98 350 cubic inch V8 produced 240 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque, making it the most powerful engine in GM's 1987 lineup. The Corvette had significant advantages over its muscle car cousins. Its fiberglass body was lighter than steel. Its sophisticated suspension was tuned for both straight-line performance and handling. Its aerodynamic profile cut through the air more efficiently than the brick-like muscle cars. In theory, it should have been untouchable by anything wearing a Buick badge. But the Corvette's performance numbers told a different story. Despite its power advantage and engineering sophistication, the C4 typically ran quarter-mile times in the low to mid 14-second range. Its 0 to 60 times, while respectable at around 5.8 seconds, weren't dramatically better than the less expensive muscle cars. More troubling for Chevrolet's flagship, it was about to be embarrassed by a car from their own corporate family. The Trans Am brought something to the fight that couldn't be measured on a dynamometer or a stopwatch: cultural cachet. Thanks to movies like Smokey and the Bandit and countless television appearances, the Trans Am had transcended mere transportation to become a cultural symbol. It represented rebellion, freedom, and unapologetic American excess. Mechanically, the Trans Am shared most of its components with the Camaro IROC-Z, including the same engine options and similar performance figures. But the Trans Am's distinctive styling, with its aggressive hood scoops and screaming chicken decals, made a statement that went far beyond mere quarter-mile times. This was a car that looked fast even when it was standing still. Yet, for all its visual drama and cultural significance, the Trans Am faced the same fundamental limitations as its Chevrolet cousin. Despite the impressive specifications and racing heritage, it simply couldn't deliver the real-world performance that would be necessary to compete with what Buick was quietly developing. Into this arena of V8-powered gladiators came the 1987 Buick Grand National, a car that broke every rule about what American performance was supposed to be. Officially rated at 245 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque from its 3.8-liter turbocharged V6, the Grand National looked more like a luxury sedan than a dragstrip warrior. But those modest displacement numbers and conservative power ratings were about to prove dramatically misleading. The Grand National's turbocharged V6 delivered power in a fundamentally different way than the naturally aspirated V8 seconds it faced. While the V8 seconds needed high revolutions per minute to make their peak power, the turbo V6 generated massive torque almost immediately off idle. The sensation of boost coming online was unlike anything the naturally aspirated competition could offer, a sudden, relentless surge of acceleration that felt more like being shot out of a cannon than driving a car. Magazine testers were consistently shocked by the Grand National's real-world performance. Quarter-mile times consistently fell into the 13.4 to 13.7 second range, with trap speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. 0 to 60 acceleration was accomplished in as little as 4.7 seconds under ideal conditions. These weren't theoretical numbers or manufacturer claims. They were repeatable, documented results that embarrassed every naturally aspirated V8 on the market. When automotive journalists finally got their hands on all these cars for direct comparison testing, the results were devastating for the V8 establishment. Car and Driver, Motor Trend, and Road and Track all reached the same shocking conclusion. The Buick Grand National was faster than America's muscle car legends. The performance gap wasn't marginal. It wasn't within the margin of testing error. The Grand National was consistently, dramatically faster than cars that cost more, looked more aggressive, and carried far more prestigious nameplates. The psychological impact on the automotive press was enormous. These were journalists who had grown up worshiping V8 engines and cubic-inch displacement. Seeing a Buick V6 demolish their heroes was like watching David beat Goliath with a slingshot. The Grand National's dominance wasn't just about peak horsepower numbers. The turbocharged V6 offered fundamental advantages that naturally aspirated V8 seconds simply couldn't match. The massive torque delivery at low revolutions per minute meant the Buick was already making serious power, while its V8 competitors were still climbing toward their power peaks. More significantly, the forced induction system allowed the relatively small V6 to generate power densities that were impossible with natural aspiration. While the Corvette's 5.7-liter V8 produced about 42 horsepower per liter, the Grand National's 3.8-liter V6 was generating over 64 horsepower per liter. This wasn't just a minor efficiency improvement, it was a completely different approach to internal combustion engine design. The weight distribution advantages were equally important. The compact V6 placed less mass over the front wheels, improving traction and handling. The Regal's aerodynamic body was more efficient than the brick-like muscle cars. Even the car's understated appearance worked to its advantage, allowing it to surprise unsuspecting street racers who judged performance by visual cues rather than actual capability. The Grand National's performance dominance created ripple effects that went far beyond magazine test results. Street racers who had spent decades building big block V8 seconds suddenly found themselves being beaten by what looked like a grandmother's sedan. Insurance companies struggled to classify a car that combined luxury car appearance with supercar performance. Even Buick dealers were caught off guard by customers who wanted to know about boost pressure and intercooler efficiency rather than leather seat options. The performance hierarchy that had dominated American automotive culture since the 1950s was crumbling. Cubic inches no longer determined quarter-mile supremacy. V8 engines were no longer automatically superior to smaller configurations. Most shocking of all, a luxury car division had built the fastest production car in America. But even this wasn't the end of the story. While automotive journalists were still trying to process the implications of the Grand National's dominance, Buick engineers were putting the finishing touches on something even more devastating. The revolution was about to enter its final phase, and the results would shock even those who thought they understood what forced induction could accomplish. The V6 had already defeated the V8 legends, but the most dramatic chapter of this story was yet to be written. The Grand National had already rewritten the rules of American performance, embarrassing every V8 legend in straight-line combat. But in 1987, Buick wasn't satisfied with merely winning the war. They wanted to deliver a knockout punch that would leave no doubt about the supremacy of forced induction technology. What they created wasn't just faster than the Grand National. It was faster than anything General Motors had ever built. The project began with a handshake at the most unlikely location imaginable. The mighty GNX was the result of a joint collaboration between Buick and ASC, divided by McLaren Performance Technologies, reportedly hatched between the two forces at the 1985 Indy 500. This wasn't corporate boardroom politics. This was racing people recognizing racing technology and deciding to push the boundaries of what was possible. McLaren Performance Technologies wasn't just another aftermarket tuner. This was the American arm of the legendary McLaren Racing Organization, the same company that had dominated Formula One and built some of the most advanced racing cars in the world. When McLaren agreed to partner with Buick on a special project, it legitimized the Grand National program in ways that no amount of magazine testing ever could. The decision to limit production was as audacious as the engineering itself. A total of just 547 cars were built by Buick with a Grand National interior and then sent to American specialty cars McLaren Performance Technologies for the GNX transformation. This wasn't mass production. This was automotive artisanship on a scale that GM had never attempted with a performance car. The production process itself was unlike anything Detroit had ever seen. Buick would build 547 Grand Nationals to specific specifications, complete with special interior trim packages. These cars would then be shipped to ASC divided by McLaren's facility in Livonia, Michigan, where they would be completely transformed. The number wasn't arbitrary. It was carefully calculated to provide exclusive distribution to select Buick dealers while maintaining the car's ultra-limited status. What McLaren did to those 547 Grand Nationals was nothing short of mechanical warfare. The standard Grand National's turbo system was already impressive, but McLaren treated it like a rough draft that needed serious revision. Improvements included a Garrett T3 turbocharger with ceramic impeller and GNX heat shield, larger capacity intercooler, and dozens of other modifications that transformed an already potent car into something approaching supercar territory. The ceramic impeller turbocharger represented cutting-edge technology that was typically reserved for military applications and exotic racing engines. Unlike traditional metal impellers, the ceramic version could spin at much higher speeds while generating less heat. This allowed the GNX to build boost pressure faster and maintain it more efficiently than any production car turbo system in existence. But the engine modifications were just the beginning. McLaren completely revised the suspension, installed larger wheels and tires, added distinctive fender vents for heat extraction, and fitted subtle aerodynamic improvements. Most importantly, they recalibrated the engine management system to extract every possible horsepower from the enhanced turbo system. Buick underrated the GNX at 276 horsepower at 4,400 revolutions per minute and a very substantial 360 pound-feet at 3,000 revolutions per minute of torque, but those conservative factory figures told only part of the story. Independent dynamometer testing suggested the real numbers were significantly higher. Some experts believe the GNX was producing closer to 300 horsepower, making it one of the most underrated performance cars in automotive history. When automotive journalists finally got behind the wheel of the GNX, the results were so shocking that some initially questioned their instruments. The GNX, with 55 more horses and an additional 25 pounds of mass, rockets to 60 in 4.7 seconds and squirts through the quarter mile in 13.5 seconds at 102 miles per hour. These weren't just impressive numbers. They represented performance that was competitive with the most exotic supercars available anywhere in the world. To put this in perspective, in 0 to 60 performance, the only car available in the United States that matches the Buick is the Callaway twin-turbo Corvette. Think about that for a moment. The only American car that could match the GNX's acceleration was a heavily modified Corvette that cost more than twice as much and required extensive aftermarket engineering. The quarter-mile performance was even more devastating. The Buick GNX sprinted to 60 miles per hour in 4.7 seconds and ran the quarter mile in 13.4 seconds with a 104 miles per hour trap speed. The Buick GNX was quicker than every single one of its muscle car contemporaries, including the Ford Mustang GT, the Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z, and the Chevrolet Corvette. But the most shocking comparison came from an unexpected source. Official track testing saw the car sprint down the quarter mile in 12.7 seconds at 113 miles per hour. What's that quicker than? A Ferrari F40. The Ferrari F40 was supposed to be the ultimate expression of Italian engineering, a car that cost more than most people's houses and represented the pinnacle of exotic car performance. Yet here was a Buick sedan that could outrun it in a straight line. Road and Track was equally stunned by the GNX's real-world performance. Officially, Buick claims a 0 to 60 miles per hour time of 5.4 seconds for the GNX versus their grand national number of 6.9. Through the quarter mile, the GNX clocks 13.4 seconds at 104 miles per hour against 15.7 at 97.5. Even these conservative manufacturer figures showed a dramatic performance advantage over the already impressive Grand National. The automotive press was struggling to process what they were experiencing. This is less than #0. 5 is greater than. Here was a car that looked like a luxury sedan but performed like a purpose-built dragster. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything they thought they understood about performance hierarchy was being systematically demolished by a Buick that most people couldn't distinguish from a rental car. Car and Driver's test team found themselves in the surreal position of timing a Buick that was faster than GM's own Corvette. The political implications were staggering. How do you explain to Chevrolet management that their flagship sports car, the vehicle that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of GM performance, was being embarrassed by a luxury car from Buick? The trap speeds were particularly telling. While acceleration times could be affected by driver skill and track conditions, trap speeds represented pure power output. The GNX's consistent trap speeds of 102 to 104 miles per hour in the quarter mile proved that its power advantage over the competition wasn't marginal. It was overwhelming. Perhaps the most bitter irony of the entire GNX program was its timing. Just as Buick had perfected the ultimate expression of turbocharged American performance, they were forced to kill it. 1987 would be the final year for the entire turbocharged Regal program. Emissions regulations, insurance pressures, and corporate politics were converging to end what had become the most successful forced induction program in American automotive history. Buick built 20,193 Grand Nationals that year, but only 547 GNXs were made. That's what makes the GNX so rare. The production numbers told the story of a program at its peak being strangled by forces beyond the engineer's control. Just as they had achieved performance levels that seemed impossible just a few years earlier, the experiment was being terminated. The GNX represented everything that was right about American automotive engineering when it was allowed to operate without bureaucratic interference. It proved that American companies could build cars that were technically sophisticated, brutally fast, and competitively priced. It demonstrated that innovation could triumph over tradition when engineers were given the freedom to pursue radical solutions. But it also represented everything that was wrong with corporate decision-making in Detroit. The GNX proved that Buick had developed technology that was years ahead of the competition, yet the program was being killed just as it reached maturity. The same corporate culture that had allowed the GNX to be created was now destroying it for reasons that had nothing to do with engineering capability or market demand. General Motors may have killed the Grand National program in 1987, but they had unknowingly created something more powerful than a production car. They had built the perfect foundation for modification, a turbocharged platform so responsive to enhancement that it would spawn an entire industry and fundamentally change American performance culture. Within months of the final Grand National rolling off the assembly line, small companies across the country were discovering that Buick's 3.8-liter turbo V6 was unlike any American performance engine that had come before. Where traditional muscle car modifications required expensive internal engine work to see significant gains, the turbo Buick responded to bolt-on modifications with dramatic power increases that left even experienced hot rodders stunned. Arizona Turbo and Performance, founded by Dennis Kirban, became the unofficial headquarters of Grand National Modification. Operating from a small facility in Arizona, ATR began developing performance parts that would define the aftermarket for decades. Their approach was methodical and revolutionary. Rather than chasing cubic inches, they focused on maximizing the efficiency of forced induction systems. ATR's first breakthrough came with improved intercoolers that reduced intake air temperatures by significant margins over the stock system. The cooler, denser air allowed engines to run more aggressive timing and boost levels safely. Their performance chips, which modified the factory engine management parameters, could unlock 20 to 30 additional horsepower with no other modifications required. The stock Garrett T3 turbocharger, while advanced for its time, was just the beginning of what was possible. Companies like Precision Turbo began developing larger turbochargers specifically for the Buick platform. The T70, T76, and eventually massive T88 turbochargers could flow dramatically more air than the factory unit, supporting power levels that seemed impossible from 3.8 liters of displacement. These larger turbochargers, combined with supporting modifications like improved fuel injectors and upgraded intercoolers, transformed Grand Nationals from 13-second street cars into legitimate 10-second machine. The modification process was relatively straightforward compared to naturally aspirated engines, which required complete internal rebuilds to achieve similar power gains. Turbo and High-Tech Performance magazine became the unofficial chronicle of Grand National modification achievements. Their dynamometer tests documented stock Grand Nationals producing around 200 wheel horsepower, while mildly modified examples routinely exceeded 300 wheel horsepower. More aggressive builds pushed into 400, 500, and eventually 600-plus wheel horsepower territory. These weren't one-off trailer queens built by professional race shops. These were street-driven cars owned by regular enthusiasts who had discovered that the Buick platform could be transformed with basic tools and weekend garage work. The Grand National's understated appearance became a crucial advantage in the modification culture that developed around it. While owners of Mustangs and Camaros advertised their modifications with aggressive visual cues, Grand National enthusiasts perfected the art of the sleeper build. The Grand National modification scene pioneered techniques that would become standard throughout the performance industry. Companies that cut their teeth developing Grand National modifications would later apply their expertise to modern turbocharged platforms. The engineering principles learned on Buick's 3.8-liter V6 directly influenced the development of aftermarket support for everything from modern Mustang EcoBoosts to import tuner cars. By the early 1990s, modified Grand Nationals were regularly outrunning exotic cars that cost 10 times as much to purchase. The platform had proven that American ingenuity could create performance that rivaled the most expensive European machinery, using technology and modification techniques that would define enthusiast culture for decades to come. The Grand National had not only embarrassed the muscle car establishment when it was new. In the hands of dedicated enthusiasts, it continued to redefine what was possible from American performance engineering long after GM had abandoned the concept. The revolution that began in Buick's engineering department had become a grassroots movement that would influence automotive culture forever. The GNX's performance didn't just embarrass the traditional muscle car establishment. It redefined what American automotive engineering could accomplish when it embraced innovation instead of nostalgia. Buick was now making America's fastest production car, as the Grand National could hit 0 to 62 miles per hour in under 5 seconds and sprint down the quarter mile in under 14 seconds, making it faster than the Ford Mustang, Chevrolet Camaro, and Pontiac Firebird at the time. This wasn't just about one car being faster than others. This was about the complete validation of a technological philosophy that Detroit had largely ignored. Forced induction wasn't just a curiosity for European exotics. It was the future of American performance, and Buick had proven it beyond any possible doubt. The GNX had accomplished something that seemed impossible in 1987. It had taken the fundamental assumptions about American muscle cars and inverted them completely. Displacement didn't matter. Cylinder count was irrelevant. Cubic inches were a relic of the past. What mattered was engineering sophistication, technological innovation, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom. In just 547 examples, the GNX had changed everything. It had proven that a small team of dedicated engineers could build a car that outperformed anything Detroit's muscle car establishment could produce. It showed that American automotive technology could be as sophisticated as anything coming from Europe or Japan. Furthermore, it had demonstrated that the future of performance would be written not in displacement and compression ratios, but in boost pressure and computer control. The revolution was complete. The V6 hadn't just beaten the V8 legends. It had obliterated them so thoroughly that the very concept of traditional American muscle seemed antiquated. But even as the GNX celebrated its victory, the forces that would end the program were already in motion. The greatest American performance car ever built would also be the last of its kind. The ink had barely dried on the automotive magazines praising the GNX when General Motors delivered the devastating news. In 1987, the Buick company made the decision that, within the year, production would come to an end for its high-performance Regal Grand National. The most successful American performance car program of the 1980s was being terminated at the peak of its capabilities. The demand for the Grand National Performance version was so high at the time that GM had to extend production well into December to meet customer demand. Dealers reported waiting lists stretching for months, yet corporate executives had already made their decision. The reasons were predictable. GM was phasing out the rear-wheel drive G-body chassis, insurance companies were reclassifying performance cars, and emissions regulations were tightening. At Buick City in Flint, Michigan, engineers who had spent a decade perfecting turbocharged technology were being reassigned to front-wheel drive projects. It was a bitter victory celebration that felt more like a wake. What happened next surprised everyone. The Grand National's cultural impact exploded into mainstream consciousness. The sinister black Regal became known as Darth Vader's car, appearing in music videos, television shows, and movies as the go-to symbol of American performance. This represented a complete inversion of Buick's traditional brand image. For decades, Buick had been associated with conservative buyers and comfort engineering. Now their most famous car was being featured in rap videos and action movies as the ultimate expression of automotive rebellion. At drag strips across America, the sight of a Grand National in the staging lanes became a signal that the competition was about to get serious. Traditional muscle car enthusiasts, many of whom had initially dismissed the Turbo V6 as a gimmick, were forced to acknowledge that the Buick wasn't just fast, it was consistently, devastatingly fast. The reverberations spread throughout Detroit like seismic aftershocks. At GM headquarters, the political implications were staggering. Ford's response was swift. The company that had pioneered the modern muscle car suddenly found themselves scrambling to develop forced induction technology. Engineering teams that had spent decades perfecting naturally aspirated Vate seconds were suddenly tasked with understanding turbochargers and boost control systems. The GNX had proven that American manufacturers could build cars with sophisticated technology when they prioritized engineering excellence over corporate politics. Insurance companies struggled to classify cars that looked like conservative luxury sedans but performed like purpose-built race cars. The aftermarket response was explosive. The turbocharged 231 cubic inch V6 engine made over 245 horsepower, while a stock 305 cubic inch Vate inches and automatic-equipped Camaro wheezed out 190 horsepower. This power density advantage meant that relatively minor modifications could produce dramatic performance improvements. Traditional muscle car builders were forced to adapt or become irrelevant. Engine shops that had spent decades building big block Chevrolets suddenly needed to understand turbocharger dynamics and fuel injection systems. Add to this were the dealer woes. The phone call came into suburban Buick in Troy, Michigan on a Tuesday morning in 1987. The caller wanted to know about boost pressure, intercooler efficiency, and quarter-mile times. The sales manager, accustomed to discussing leather seat options and ride quality, found himself completely out of his depth. "Sir," he finally admitted, "I think you want the Chevrolet dealer down the street." This scene played out in Buick showrooms across America as the Grand National created an identity crisis that no automotive franchise had ever faced. How do you sell America's fastest production car when your sales staff has spent decades perfecting the art of selling comfort and luxury to retirees? Buick's corporate response was to hastily assemble technical training programs for their dealer network, but the results were often comical. Sales representatives who could explain the virtues of velour upholstery suddenly needed to understand turbocharger lag, premium fuel requirements, and the significance of boost gauges. Many simply gave up, directing performance-minded customers to brochures while secretly hoping they'd buy a LeSabre instead. the service departments faced even greater challenges. Technicians trained on naturally aspirated V6 seconds found themselves confronting turbocharger oil feed lines, intercooler plumbing, and computer-controlled fuel injection systems that required entirely different diagnostic approaches. Emergency training sessions became commonplace as dealers realized their service bays were unprepared for customers who actually used their Grand National's performance capabilities. The disconnect between Buick's traditional customer base and Grand National buyers created daily awkwardness in showrooms across the country. Elderly customers shopping for Park Avenues would find themselves sharing waiting areas with tattooed 20-somethings clutching Motor Trend articles about quarter-mile times. Sales staff struggled to explain why this particular Buick required premium fuel and had a boost gauge where the oil pressure gauge usually Saturday. As Grand National demand exploded, allocation battles erupted throughout the dealer network. Traditional high-volume Buick dealers, accustomed to moving LeSabres and Electras, found themselves competing with smaller dealers who had cultivated performance-oriented customer bases. Corporate allocation formulas based on historical luxury car sales suddenly seemed absurd when applied to America's hottest performance car. Some dealers resorted to creative interpretations of allocation rules, trading luxury car allocations with other dealers to accumulate Grand Nationals. Others simply marked up prices dramatically, treating the cars as limited collector items rather than regular inventory. The warranty department became a battlefield as performance-oriented customers pushed their Grand Nationals far beyond typical Buick usage patterns. Claims for turbocharger failures, transmission problems, and suspension component wear skyrocketed compared to the division's sedate luxury cars. Corporate warranty policies, designed around low-stress driving patterns, proved inadequate for customers who regularly launched their cars from traffic lights. Service advisors found themselves in the uncomfortable position of explaining to customers that racing their cars voided warranties, while simultaneously trying to maintain the performance image that sold the cars in the first place. Perhaps most challenging was the complete transformation of showroom culture. Buick dealerships, traditionally quiet havens for mature customers seeking comfortable transportation, suddenly became gathering places for street racers, sharing modification tips and performance stories. The visual contrast was stark: wire-wheeled Electras parked next to sinister black Regals with aftermarket exhaust systems. The Grand National had accomplished something unprecedented in automotive retail. It forced an entire dealer network to abandon decades of established practice and adapt to selling genuine high performance. Many succeeded, creating hybrid cultures that serve both traditional Buick customers and performance enthusiasts. Others never adapted, losing potential sales to dealers who embraced the revolution. By the time production ended, Buick's dealer network had been permanently changed. They had learned to sell speed alongside comfort, performance alongside luxury. But for many, the education came too late to fully capitalize on America's most unlikely muscle car phenomenon. A total of 20,740 Grand Nationals were built for 1987. Of those, exactly 547 became GNXs. These numbers told the story of a program achieving everything except longevity. The engineers who created the GNX understood what was being thrown away. They had built a car that outperformed vehicles costing twice as much, proven American engineering could match anything from Europe or Japan. Instead, that foundation was being demolished just as it reached its potential. The Grand National accomplished something impossible in the 1980s. It made cubic inches irrelevant. The best muscle car that America has ever made does not even have a V8 for an engine. Displacement, the holy grail since the 1950s, had been revealed as obsolete. Forced induction and engineering sophistication proved more important than traditional hot-rodding wisdom. Decades later, the prophecy came true. Ford's EcoBoost engines, Chevrolet's Turbo 4s, even modern Corvettes embraced forced induction. The technology Buick perfected in the 1980s became the foundation for every high-performance engine built today. The Grand National proved that innovation could triumph over tradition, that engineering excellence could overcome corporate conservatism. It showed American manufacturers could build world-class performance cars when they prioritized capability over convention. If Buick's 3.8-liter turbo V6 could topple the giants in 1987, what does that say about the true muscle car legend? The era ended, but the revolution had begun. The V6 that destroyed the V8 establishment became the blueprint for everything that followed. The future arrived in a matte black Buick, and the V8 giants were never the same.